Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Israel says it has fired warning shots into Syria after a mortar round fired from Syria hit an Israeli post in the Golan Heights. It's the first time the Jewish state has fired on Syrian forces since the Middle East War of 1973. The incident happened on the same day as a coalition was formed in Doha to oppose President Bashar al-Assad's government. Last week, the British Prime Minister David Cameron said he would not rule out the idea of accepting a safe passage for Assad if it meant an end to the conflict that has so far claimed more than 35,000 lives. But this was ruled out by Assad himself when, in a television interview he gave to Russian television, he said he would die in Syria. So now there is a unified opposition group. How effective will it be? Is the idea of a safe passage for Assad a real possibility? And what about the role of Britain and the West in ending the bloodshed? Well, to discuss this and more, I am joined by Christian Benedict, campaign manager for Amnesty International UK, Harry Phibbs, who is a conservative journalist for the Conservative Home website, Father Nadim Nassar, who's an Anglican priest from Syria and director of the Awareness Foundation. And on the line we have Sami Haddad, who's an activist for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me here on The Voice of Russia. Nadim Nassar, what did you make of Israel sending a $100,000 missile into Syria for the first time since 1973?
Some people are linking this to the warning. President said that he will drag the whole area into a war. But I don't think it is more than warning, and it's saying this is a red line, don't cross it again. And whether it was a mistake or not, who knows? I wouldn't interpret it in any serious way. There are other serious issues than such an incident.
Sami Haddad from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the military chief of staff of Israel did warn Israeli troops, to be on high alert and to prevent the conflict in Syria from crossing the border. So this is quite significant, isn't it?
Yes, I agree that it's only a warning, but I think what happened yesterday should remind all Syrians who the true enemy is, to not give up on the Palestinian cause and to not forget that the Zionist movement is the real enemy in the Middle East for all Syrians and for all Arab countries.
Christian Benedict from Amnesty International, the issue of the wider conflict is a very real one, isn't it? And again, we saw demonstrations, for instance, after the killing of Wissam al-Hassan's funeral saw thousands of people taken to the streets, anger at Syrian involvement in Lebanese politics. This is quite a concern in that the whole region could be engulfed, and that has huge human rights implications, doesn't it?
It's something Amnesty have been saying for some time now, and with the latest incident with this missile into Syria, I mean, we're still at Amnesty looking into what exactly happened. We would call on all of the parties to ensure that civilians are obviously protected. Our Israel team is looking into it. As I said, obviously their priority right now is to look at the incidents within Gaza and Israel as a priority.
Harry Phibbs, there's several countries being drawn into this. I mean, what would a Conservative-led coalition be thinking about how to respond?
I think that David Cameron is probably very ashamed of the failure and the delay and the dithering of the West. I think there's obviously a difficulty for Britain to act without the United States, and so I don't think that that Britain should be unduly ashamed. But certainly the Obama administration's policy of just trying to keep out of it has been a terrible failure. We've got 35,000 deaths, and I think the Syrian people will eventually overthrow the regime. I think they'll eventually win their freedom, but there's a terrible cost in terms of deaths and in terms of refugees. And the idea that somehow if America keeps out of it, that it'll contain the situation has been proven to be wrong, as we've been discussing. Israel getting drawn in, Turkey, Jordan, these American allies that would be looking to America to provide some leadership, and they've failed to, and so there's been confusion. But I just wanted to disagree with something Sami said, that I think the enemy for the Syrian people is the dictatorship, is the Syrian regime, and that's where the battle is, and that's where the focus should be on. And they've had, under the father and the son, decades of dictatorship, and they're fighting for their freedom. And what the West should be doing is finding an effective way of trying to advance that cause and to speed it up.
With regard to the West trying to advance that cause, the idea of the coalition being finally formed was very much driven by the West, wasn't it, Nadim Nassar? And are you satisfied with the coalition of the opposition, whether it's going to be effective?
I think the opposition has made a big step in Doha, but also they are still fragmented, they are still divided. Power is still a huge issue within the structure. I think what is missing is a plan to get out of this trouble. Harry, it's not, I believe personally, it's not 35,000 people dead, over 100,000 dead.
Right.
I do believe that. And the change is imminent. We can't go back. But now how do we look forward? The failure of the West, Brendan, I think, is to initiate. If the West is also pontificating about democracy and civilization and freedom of speech and all the values of the West, where are these values when it comes to their foreign policy? All what I hear from Western leaders talking about war, talking about David Cameron threatening to arm the opposition. Where are the Western values of democracy and dialogue? Why don't we launch a war against the neighboring countries in
surely,
Europe?
But this coalition of the opposition is a step towards that dialogue, isn't it? All sides, including Qatar, who have been accused of arming rebels, who brokered these talks, have insisted that there's no unified opposition voice to talk to.
There is no unified.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. We're discussing the situation in Syria with Christian Benedict, who is the campaign manager for Amnesty International UK, Harry Phibbs, conservative journalist for the Conservative Home website, Reverend Nadim Nassar, an Anglican priest from Syria and director of the Awareness Foundation, and on the line we have Sami Haddad, activist for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. So yesterday is a step in the right direction, in that now there is a kind of...
Nobody is talking about dialogue. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't heard Cameron or Obama or Angela Merkel or anybody from Europe from the West talking about dialogue. I've been following it day by day. Anybody talked about dialogue?
Well, Christian Benedict, I'd like to get your view on what's your view of this coalition?
Well, they've been brought together to an extent. I mean, there are some groups calling for dialogue. For us, the concern is that this group sends out some very strong signals around respecting international humanitarian law, around calling for security sector reform, rule of law, equality and non-discrimination, sending out some very, very clear signals to I would say the great mass of the Syrian population who are not really with the organised or disorganised opposition, however you want to frame it, or with the government, sending out signals that there is an alternative to the current status quo. And for us, that means having some very clear red lines themselves, especially with regards to the methods and means of conflict that the armed opposition operates. For us, that's absolutely critical. It's very difficult to have security sector reform, very difficult to have an opposition that respects human rights and international humanitarian law if they're not organised.
Nobody's respecting that.
And it's important that governments that understand how to organise and understand international law, regardless of the inconsistencies granted, are involved. European countries, the US to an extent, do need to be involved, and we can't criticise them all the time if they are doing the right things in this particular context.
Can I ask that, Sami Haddad from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, do you think that the West needs to be involved in this, and do you have any confidence in this national coalition for opposition and revolutionary forces that it will be effective?
I don't think this is different from the Syrian National Council. You see the same way the West backed the Syrian National Council are now backing this coalition. They refused negotiations with the regime as a term they all signed. Not all the sides of the opposition were a part of this coalition, so the opposition is not united yet. The National Coordination Body was not part of the coalition, nor was the Syrian Democratic Platform. One of the main terms they signed on was to back the rebel fighters in Syria. So this will only intensify the war that's going on now. This will not provide any humanitarian aid for the people, nor will it provide a ceasefire for the people. I think any step that doesn't include a ceasefire in the main terms of it is only deemed to be a failure, and it will only intensify the destruction of the country. and the destruction of the Syrian infrastructure.
But in terms of the Syrian National Council, which you've referred to, this has got to be a better alternative. The Syrian National Council simply wasn't seen to be representing the interests of a very disparate population.
The Syrian National Council was created in Istanbul of Turkey. This was created in Qatar. It's the same principles. It's the same sort of exclusion of other opposition parties and other opposition sides. It still calls itself, like the Syrian Council once called itself, as the main opposition figure and the only representative of the people. This does not represent all the people. The national coordination body represents a broad mass of the people. So does the Syrian Democratic Platform. So this might be a step towards better country, but there are many criticisms of it.
Nadim Nassar, do you think the interests of women, ethnic Kurds, Christians and Alawites will be represented adequately with this new coalition of opposition?
They will be represented, no doubt about it. But as a Christian, as a priest from Syria, I'm more concerned than ever about minorities in Syria, because the opposition is not controlling who is fighting in Syria. I know from family, from friends, from people from inside Syria, we are seeing elements in Syria happening now, what happened in Iraq, which resulted in Christian immigration, massive Christian immigration from Iraq. And now the percentage of Christianity in Iraq is not more than 2%. And in Syria, we were 12%. And God knows after some months what the percentage will be. I'm taking Christianity. I'm not just defending Christianity. I'm taking Christianity as an example because I'm a priest. If you tell me, do you want your family out of Syria? Yes, I want my family out of Syria. Although I encourage the Christians to stay in Syria, but I understand when Christians flee for their lives. And I know my wonderful friend, the head of the Bible Society in Aleppo, now is kidnapped for the last 2 weeks. Nobody knows where he is. George Anderia, who's a lovely man, is disappeared. Thousands of Christians, hundreds of thousands of Christians are dislocated from their homes. I'm not making that as an exceptional case, but I'm saying minorities are suffering. People are suffering. Islamic radicalism is playing a significant role in Syria. Let's not underestimate their impact on the conflict in Syria. And I blame the opposition because they are allowing, or they are turning the blind eye to these radicals to be active on their behalf. So what is the atrocities being happened for Amnesty and for other organizations are absolutely horrible from both sides.
You talk about the opposition as if it was a single group, the opposition.
No.
My point about saying that the West has made a terrible mistake just being neutral and keeping out of it, and America just we'll leave it to the United Nations, which, given the veto from China and Russia, just effectively means just keeping out of it and leaving them to it. That's a great mistake. First of all, because it's prolonged the war and it means it'll take longer for the opposition to overthrow the regime. But also it means that the problems will be worse in terms of the chaos in the opposition, and it means that the extremists will be getting arms supplies from the Saudis and so on. Whereas if the Americans were getting involved and had got involved earlier with facilitating diplomatic unity and pulling them together, making sure that there was that the supplies were going and the leadership was promoted for responsible forces who believe in freedom and democracy, that would have been a much better thing in terms of the abuses that we're having in terms of failure to accept minority rights and human rights and so on, which I agree are taking place among opposition forces. That's not an argument for the West keeping out of it. I think, on the contrary, I think it's a failure of the West to have kept out of it. It's made that worse.
Indeed, Harry Phibbs, so when yesterday General Sir David Richards says there were contingency plans in place for a limited response in case of a worsening humanitarian crisis in Syria, does that, in your view, open the possibility of some kind of military intervention eventually that David Cameron may be considering?
Yeah. Look, I think it's better late than never. I think it's appalling that there's been such delay. If we can now get the West actually being responsible and being involved in trying to bolster the opposition forces who are behaving responsibly, then that would be something that would be welcome.
Sami Haddad, what did you make of the statement by General Sir David Richards? He has opened the possibility of some kind of military intervention.
I don't agree with current struggle that's taking place in Syria, and I don't agree with foreign intervention, because we have seen foreign intervention before in Iraq and in Libya, where 40,000 civilians were killed by the aerial bombardment on Libya. So I don't think foreign military intervention will bring any good for Syria, or will end the suffering of the Syrian people.
Harry Phibbs, also the comment made last week by David Cameron where he said he wouldn't be averse to the idea of safe passage for Assad. Do you think he was serious when he said that? Because it seems to have been battered away a bit by the US Secretary of State, who effectively said that Assad needs to be held accountable for what he's done. There's a bit of a disconnect between the US and the British position on that, isn't there?
Yes, I think that's it's an unlikely scenario. So in a way, I think it's not the most important intervention. But what I suspect is that in private, David Cameron is pushing the Americans to go further, and we get an indication of how David Cameron's thinking is not just over his comments on this, but over Libya, where difference in approach between David Cameron and President Obama was clear. I think it's difficult to justify the failure over Syria with Libya, and there were some delays with Libya as well. But that's 6 million Libyans. Why are they more important than 22 million Syrians? Why is it that the West should feel entitled to just forget about any moral leadership as far as Syria is concerned? We should be and the no-fly zone. I think there should be a no-fly zone in Syria, which another term is used. No-fly zone. Of course, in Libya, it meant very actively taking out command and control positions of the Gaddafi regime. So it's not just about stopping.
But a no-fly zone in Libya was a lot easier because it was mainly on the northern coast. A no-fly zone in Syria is going to be a lot more difficult. But is a no-fly zone important from a humanitarian perspective, Christian Bennett?
I think just to follow up on what Harry is saying, many officials in many, if you call it, Western governments are actually looking at this from a human rights or an ethical perspective, not in totality, but they are in the sense, following on what Sami said, that let's not brush over how many civilians died in the intervention in Libya, and certainly we know more about that in Iraq. This is not something to gloss over. It's far from certain that any form of military intervention, whether it's a no-fly zone, a safe haven, corridors, which are all interventions, would protect civilians. And those risks need to be looked at properly and assessed properly. And that's why it's taken so long. It's a very complex situation, way more complex than Libya in this regard. So I don't think it's accurate to say that governments, Western governments, the US, haven't been actively involved. They have, and have been assessing the situation, and they have been mapping and screening different opposition elements to see who could they potentially work with. I think it's too easy to call for things like no-fly zones and safe havens and what have you without doing a proper risk assessment. And it's absolutely right that the UK military do that. Obviously, they would have contingency plans all the time for these sorts of incidents. I think the Chief of Defence Staff was just stating the obvious there, and I think a lot of people are reading probably too much into it.
I think there are lots of military technical difficulties, and so obviously that's a matter of where expertise is needed. And certainly in the case of Libya, there was clear opposition territory, wasn't there? And so that did make it easier, and the regime was using air attacks much more than Assad. So there are differences, but I also think that although it might be harder, it would still be the right thing to do. And I certainly think that in Libya, the Western intervention shortened the war and it saved lives. And while there may well have be two sides to it in terms of some lives, that overall that was the impact in Libya, and that's what would happen in Syria.
Nadeem Nassar, what's your reaction to that?
I think this is a disaster. What you're saying, Harry, you don't know what you're talking about in Syria. The Syrian army is not the Libyan army. The Air Force in Syria, the power of the Air Force is not to compare with the Libyan. I was on a debate with Intelligence Squared, and one journalist said, "Father, you don't know the Syrian army is paper tigers, and in 1 month they will defect and fall." And that was 6 months ago, and the Syrian army is not paper tigers, and it will not work because any military intervention, whether no-fly zone or a full intervention or arming the opposition, it will be a disaster for Syria. The best thing happened in Lebanon to finish the war is when everybody went to Ta'if, which is a city in Saudi Arabia, sat around the table and put all the cards on the table and found a plan out of the conflict. Because the Lebanese civil war brought international forces and regional forces into intervention. All kinds of forces were there in Lebanon. Syria was involved, Iraq was involved, Israel was involved. What happened? It was a disaster. I lived 7 years of that. And Syria, everybody is involved. Let's ask the West and Russia and China and Turkey and Iran to put pressure on their allies in order to sit around the table and talk. Any military intervention, whatever it is, it will be a colossal disaster for Syria.
Well, that was something that was raised by Bashar al-Assad last week in an interview he gave. He said that he would be prepared to die in Syria. Just a quick reaction about his interview last week. It seemed to be quite a defiant message, didn't it?
Brendan, it's a waste of time and effort to talk about a safe passage to Assad. Assad is not leaving, and if he decided to leave, he has his own channels to secure his safe passage. I think it's diverting our attention from the conflict by wasting our time. And Cameron is a champion in wasting time when it comes to Syria. He says nothing valuable and nothing important. Safe passage? Who cares about what Cameron thinks? If Assad wants a safe passage, he will find a safe passage. Don't worry about him.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing Syria with Christian Benedict, Harry Phibbs, Nadim Nassar and Sami Haddad. Christian Benedict, Amnesty International must be concerned about the language being used of military intervention in terms of what it will mean on the ground in terms of a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, what's your views on that? Of course,
so we've been saying this consistently for well over a year, that with any form of military intervention, there's huge risks for the civilian population, and we said that ahead of Libya. We've said it's ahead of many different conflict situations. So we constantly stress that any planning that may be going on, any actions that may be going on, whether it's from conventional forces or whether it is arming different armed groups, that thorough risk assessments need to be taken account of to ensure that any intervention does not negatively impact on the civilian population. And that's why I guess you've seen some frustration from some Syrian activists, even towards Amnesty. The active support hasn't been as forthcoming because governments are doing those risk assessments as much as they can and realising that this ain't going to be as easy as they think it is. Governments are in a sort of twilight zone, as it were, between this position of having a ceasefire and leading towards negotiations or some sort of conflict-related situation, because I can see the logic of what you're saying, Father Nadim. I think the difficulty is Assad and elements within the senior leadership of the Ba'ath Party have calculated that if there was, let's follow this through to its logical conclusion, if there was a ceasefire and negotiations leading towards credible internationally organised elections, that the Ba'ath Party wouldn't win. And they want to maintain power. Their interest is not protecting civilians in Syria. It's maintaining power for their power base. People have calculated that scenario and said,
you are supposing that the election is the outcome of the negotiation. I'm not supposing anything, because the election in the present situation is a disaster. It's a catastrophe, because what election after 100,000 dead? What are you going to do with election? We need a change. We need a plan to bring change to Syria, but to the better future of the Syrians and spare lives. This is what we want. We don't want election at the moment.
Sure. I'm talking about the logical long-term conclusion. Sure, you would have a transitional phase, which, to pick up on what Sami was saying, is even with this coalition in Doha, it's not fully representative. And that's part of the difficulties many people inside Syria have, which is, well, we have one government that is imposing itself on the people. Should we really expect another coalition to impose itself, or should there be some form of transitional phase leading toward an election?
Sami Haddad from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, you're clearly against military intervention, but there needs to be some degree of humanitarian intervention, though, doesn't there?
Of course, any humanitarian intervention or any political intervention is welcomed in Syria. But I think the regime in Syria has to change. But the method of changing this regime or to oust this regime is what shapes the future of Syria. If you want to change this regime by following its same methods of killing and torture and detaining civilians, you will only create a regime that follows the same methods of dictatorship. I think the way the regime should change in Syria, that it should maintain its peaceful stance, that it should refuse any foreign military intervention, that it should try to create a sense of citizenship for the people and not to be religiously extremist. So if you want to change the regime in Syria, you should convince the people that are supporting the regime that what's going to come in the future is better than this regime.
Harry Phibbs, I guess the UK will obviously be central to any kind of discussions at the UN Security Council, and there's talks coming up. What more can the UK do now?
It's obviously progress that we've got the Syrian National Coalition established, and that's welcome. Clearly, the United Nations is a waste of time, and to talk about leaving that to the United Nations is just code for washing their hands of the situation and doing nothing. So, but I think that where obviously Britain does have some diplomatic clout is with the United States, and the great source of hope in all this is the Syrian people. That they're the great allies in wanting to have a peaceful and free future for Syria, and that the majority of the Syrian people, they don't support the regime, the dictatorship. They obviously don't support al-Qaeda and terrorism. They obviously don't believe in abusing human rights. And so really the role of the West should be to strengthen the decent majority of people in Syria who share those fundamental values. We shouldn't get entirely sort of full of despair over it. There are obviously military considerations about how the West should be involved in whether they should be supplying non-lethal supplies or whether it's safe to supply arms without them getting into the wrong hands. So there are lots of discussion about the military feasibility of it. I think there's also a risk in continuing to just do nothing.
Nadeem Nassar, how do you see it playing out in the months to come?
The excuse for silence, I agree with Harry totally. The excuse for silence is absolutely not there any longer. But saying the American election, and we don't know what's going on. Now the American administration is in place. Silence is not an option any longer. If Europe and the West and America and the UK, they want to play a role in solving the problem, they have to facilitate diplomatic negotiation and diplomatic efforts to put pressure on their allies and ask Russia and China to put pressure on their allies in order to get out of this conflict. Silence is not an option any longer, and I'm appalled that the West is ignoring Syria in this terrible way.
Sadly, we've run out of time. I'd just like to thank my guests, Nadeem Nassar, Anglican priest from Syria and director of the Awareness Foundation, Christian Benedict, who is the campaign manager for Amnesty International UK, Harry Phibbs, conservative journalist for the Conservative Home website, and on the line, Sami Haddad, activist for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
Into a war, but I don't think it is more than warning, and it's saying this is a red line, don't cross it again, and whether it was a mistake or not, who knows. I wouldn't interpret it in any serious way. There are other serious issues than such an incident.
Sami Haddad from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The military chief of staff of Israel did warn Israeli troops, to be on high alert and to prevent the conflict in Syria from crossing the border. So this is quite significant, isn't it?
Yes, I agree that it's only a warning, but I think what happened yesterday should remind all Syrians who the true enemy is, to not give up on the Palestinian cause and to not forget that the Zionist movement is the real enemy in the Middle East.
They shouldn't be thinking about how to respond.
I think that David Cameron is probably very ashamed of the failure and the delay and the dithering of the West. I think there's obviously a difficulty for Britain to act without the United States, and so I don't think that that Britain should be unduly ashamed. But certainly the Obama administration's policy of just trying to keep out of it has been a terrible failure. We've got 30,000, 35,000 deaths, and I think the Syrian people will eventually overthrow the regime. I think they'll eventually win their freedom, but there's a terrible cost in terms of deaths and in terms of refugees. And the idea that somehow if America keeps out of it, that it'll contain the situation has been proven to be wrong, as we've been discussing. Israel getting drawn in, Turkey, Jordan, these
Russian television, he said he would die in Syria. So now there is a unified opposition group. How effective will it be? Is the idea of a safe passage for Assad a real possibility? And what about the role of Britain and the West in ending the bloodshed? Well, to discuss this and more, I am joined by Christian Benedict, campaign manager for Amnesty International UK, Harry Phibbs, who is a conservative journalist for the Conservative Home website, Father Nadim Nassar, who's an Anglican priest from Syria and director of the Awareness Foundation. And on the line we have Sami Haddad, who's an activist for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me here on The Voice of Russia. Nadim Nassar, what did you make of Israel sending a $100,000 missile into Syria for the first time since 1973?
Some people are linking this to the warning President said that he will drag the whole area into
for all Syrians and for all Arab countries.
Christian Benedict from Amnesty International. The issue of the wider conflict is a very real one, isn't it? And again, we saw demonstrations, for instance, after the killing of Wissam al-Hassan's funeral, saw thousands of people taken to the streets. Anger at Syrian involvement in Lebanese politics. This is quite a concern in that the whole region could be engulfed, and that has huge human rights implications, doesn't it?
It's something Amnesty have been saying for some time now, and with the latest incident with this missile into Syria, I mean, we're still at Amnesty looking into what exactly happened. We would call on all of the parties to ensure that civilians are obviously protected. Our Israel team is looking into it. As I said, obviously their priority right now is to look at the incidents within Gaza and Israel as a priority.
Harry Phibbs, there's several countries being drawn into this. I mean, what would a Conservative-led coalition? Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Israel says it has fired warning shots into Syria after a mortar round fired from Syria hit an Israeli post in the Golan Heights. It's the first time the Jewish state has fired on Syrian forces since the Middle East War of 1973. The incident happened on the same day as a coalition was formed in Doha to oppose President Bashar al-Assad's government. Last week, the British Prime Minister David Cameron said he would not rule out the idea of accepting a safe passage for Assad if it meant an end to the conflict that has so far claimed more than 35,000 lives. But this was ruled out by Assad himself when, in a television interview he gave to